So now with VCF Operations 9, there are new platform monitoring improvements. So it now ships with a new supervisor management pack with a tighter integration between vCenter adapter and supervisor monitoring. So supervisors in a given vCenter will be monitored by default. So if we go to administration, integrations, and repository, so here you will see a native management pack to monitor the Kubernetes supervisor clusters. This is already configured, and which is a native integration with supervisors and VMware Kubernetes service. So you also have a new push mechanism is implemented for basically sending the metrics from supervisor to VCF operations. The next change is we bring in additional metrics through the kube state metrics, that's the KSN, for the supervisor. So it is a service that generates metrics about the state of Kubernetes objects. So earlier supervisor had only telegraph. So now with kube state metrics, it will provide additional metrics about the Kubernetes inventory. It helps create those in relationships within the objects. And thereafter, telegraph collects the metrics and pushes them into VCF operations. So I'm right now logged into the vCenter where we have the WCP service enabled. And so under home, supervisor management. So here you can see the namespaces that have been configured. And also we have a supervisor that has been created and is in running state. Next, we log into the VCF Operations 9 and enable the VKS monitoring. So we can do that by getting into administration, integrations. And under accounts, we already have the vCenter added as a data source here. So in case of VCF, we would add the SDC manager details where VCF operations will auto discover the management and the workload vCenter, which will have the supervisor running on that. So we have the vCenter already added here and again being monitored by the cloud proxy. Now under advanced settings, you see a new option that got added that's for enabling the vSphere supervisor collection. So this is enabled by default and is set to true. So, which means VCF operations will perform the automated monitoring of setting the configuration of the telegraph agents in supervisor cluster. And if customers chooses to set it to false, the telegraph monitoring will be disabled. So here you can see that the vCenter is configured, and we also see the vSphere supervisor adapter also got created, which means it has created in vCenter endpoint API for supervisor and VCF operations integrations. So now we'll select the supervisor adapter and get into the object details. So here we'll be able to see the overall inventory and also the object types. You can see the adapter state is healthy. So now starting with the supervisor cluster. So under metrics, so we are getting the CPU usage for the supervisor cluster. You can see the overall usage of the CPU supervisor cluster. You can see the overall memory usage. We can also have the network metrics around the transmit error packets, right? We can also see those. So we can see the receive packet drops. We can see the transmit error totals, transmit packet drops. All these metrics are available here. So under summary, we can find the overall historical trend of the number of containers that got created, number of pods that got created as well. So as a child of the supervisor cluster object, we have the nodes, and we also have the namespaces object and the guest VKS cluster. So as we expand further any of the node object, we can see the pods running within the nodes. And from the pod, we can hover over to the container. So we are looking at all the pods here within the node. And let's pick one of the pod. In this case, I'll pick the core DNS. This is one of the pod here. So for this particular pod, we have the CPU metrics. We can get to the CPU usage metrics here. And we can also see the memory usage for the pod as well. Also the network metrics, and under performance, we also have KPI to monitor the overall performance of the pod. As we expand this further, we'll be able to see the container within that pod, and we'll be able to see the container metrics as well. So we can see like the CPU usage for the container, and again the memory usage. So this is specific to the core DNS container. And under namespaces, we can go to the individual workloads. We have the deployments and the daemon sets. So this is that one of the deployment. And from here, we can go to the pods and the containers as well. Again, so you can click on the deployment here and also fetch the metrics like the CPU usage, the memory usage. Pretty much you have all the metrics coverage for your daemon sets, deployments, as well as your pods and the containers. And all this within a supervisor cluster. So this covers the monitoring of the supervisor cluster metrics. So now let's look at the VKS or the workload or the guest cluster. So for monitoring the workload clusters, so let me go back to the vCenter. There is a new supervisor management proxy service that is introduced with the supervisor. So this should be enabled within the vCenter. You can confirm by going to the vCenter services here. Here we see that it's already enabled and installed for the supervisor. Which is built on top of the NSX management proxy and is a service within supervisor that sends the workload cluster metrics to VCF operations. On workload cluster, we enable the metrics collection by installing the Telegraph agents as well as the Prometheus package. So now with VCF operations, we'll see the VKS guest cluster. So you can see like this is the guest cluster within the supervisor cluster. And by expanding it, we can get into the particular nodes and the namespaces to fetch the monitoring metrics. Like under metrics, we'll be able to see the CPU usage for the workload VKS cluster, also the memory for the VKS cluster. So overall, we'll be able to see the performance KPIs as well. Under summary, we'll be able to see again the same number of pods or the historical trend of the number of containers that got created and so on. So we also introduced new dashboards that got updated in 9.0. So if you go to infrastructure operations dashboards, we see three new dashboards, and there's a separate category under vSphere Supervisor. So the first dashboard is all about the Kubernetes inventory. So basically it shows you about the Kubernetes inventory here. As you click on a supervisor cluster, it will show you the overall inventory, the number of containers, number of nodes, number of pods got created, number of supervisors you have. You can see the number of nodes, namespaces demonstrated within your supervisor, the VKS clusters that have got created. You can see the namespaces here, the workloads, pods, containers. And you have the second dashboard is on the Kubernetes VKS. It will show only the guest cluster deployments. So it will show the CPU throttling, which is an implementation of restrictions on how CPU resources a container can consume. So you can see a trend of the CPU throttling for the VKS cluster. And you can see the nodes here. And you can also see the performance of etcd. So etcd basically is like a leader election, which ensures a single node manages writes and replication for consistent data storage across the cluster. So basically the leader will handle all the client requests requiring consensus while the followers will replicate the leader's log entries. You can also monitor the API server request rates as well. You can see the overall namespaces that are part of the cluster. Now, within your VKS cluster, the pod and container monitoring is set to false, which you can opt in to monitor the pods and containers for important clusters. Like say, suppose you want to enable the pod and container monitoring for specific guest clusters, you can do that by getting into the configuration tab and going to edit options here. You can see like by default, the option is disabled, but you can enable it and enable the pod and container monitoring only for the critical guest clusters. But one thing is we have to make sure that the VCF operations is properly sized and it is following the sizing guidelines to take care of these additional metrics. This concludes the monitoring of supervisor clusters and the VKS clusters with the new VCF operations 9.